In this lesson, we'll tackle how do cells maintain themselves. In our scene of bacteria, we'll be learning about this process here shown in the green. But first, to set the stage, we have food entering. So here we have glucose entering the cell through the membrane, through proteins inserted into the membrane. A team of other proteins begin to break the chemical bonds, releasing some energy. The high energy molecules left over are going to power the pumps. The pumps will pump hydrogen ions, protons, across the membrane. They collect like water in a dam. This protein here will allow those protons to rush back into the cell, and that energy is used to create ATP molecules, which carry usable quantities of energy to do the chemistry of life. And now it's time to see what's going on in the chemistry in the cytoplasm here. Well, this protein then is specialized to bind two different molecules and make a chemical bond between them. And this is how proteins can build the cell's molecular parts. So the molecules, the green one and the red one, there might be nutrients in food. So they were imported into the cell, or they were broken down from more complex food items. And so here are some nutrients, and the job of this protein is to make a chemical bond between the two of them. So first it has to get hold of them. This protein happens to be sticky with these two types of molecules, not many other kinds of molecules, but these two molecules stick to this protein in just these places, these binding sites. So the idea is this protein is going to force these two molecules together to create a chemical bond, and then the larger molecule will detach and float around in the cytoplasm, and the job of the protein is done. Now, proteins make chemical bonds by forcing the reacting molecules to share electrons. The cell must have reserves of chemical energy to power this chemistry. So it takes energy to push these molecules together. So there's going to have to be an input of energy for this chemistry to happen. You'll recall it took energy to make the chemical bond between a hydrogen atom and an oxygen atom. Why is that? Because the electrons in the hydrogen atom will repel the electrons in the oxygen atom. But if we can push the atoms close enough together, then we get the chemical bond, where the atoms will share the pair of electrons. But it takes work to do that. It takes energy to do that. In the cell, the energy to power this process then comes from ATP. So the external source of energy is supplied by ATP molecules, which store the energy released from food molecules. So again, it takes energy to make this chemical bond. So this process of building things inside the cell requires energy, because molecules have to be pushed together to make those chemical bonds. You'll recall this scene from an earlier lesson. We have glucose being metabolized, and the pumps are powered, and we have a gradient of hydrogen ions, and that's used to power the production of ATP, and ATP will then go on and power the chemistry of life. Let's return to our protein. Here we see the protein then, in order to have the energy to make that chemical bond, it has to bind an ATP molecule. Now I'm indicating that the ATP molecule has a quantity of energy available, indicating with a sort of a plus sign here. So it's ready to go. It's charged with energy. Now what's going to happen then down here in this scene, the ATP molecule is going to give up its energy, in a sense, to help the protein push these molecules together to make that chemical bond. And as the ATP gives up its energy, it's converted into a molecule called ADP. And this must be recharged with energy. Now, what's the difference between ADP and ATP? Well, here we see ATP up here. It's got 3 of these phosphate groups. And this part of the molecule is called adenosine. So the molecule is adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate, 3 phosphates. It's the chemical bond between these last 2 that has that quantity of energy that was powering the chemistry down here. So when the ATP gives up its energy, in a sense what's happening is that 3rd phosphate's being broken off, and the energy released here is used to power the chemical bond here. As a result, then, you have ADP, adenosine diphosphate, di for 2. This molecule has to be recharged. It has to get its 3rd phosphate group stuck back on it. And that's why the cell has to continue to metabolize food, so it can recharge these ADP molecules into ATP. Back to our picture then, the ADP is going to have to go back and get another phosphate group, and we see that right here. So we have the protein doing its chemistry, ATP is supplying the energy, ADP has to go back and get recharged with energy, making it ATP, and then that ATP will be able to power more chemistry. And that whole process of recycling this energy requires food be constantly metabolized so that ATP can be regenerated. So we see in this scene down here then, we've got proteins building more complicated molecules from raw materials. And that process requires energy supplied by ATP. But why not use glucose itself to power cell chemistry? So we can imagine glucose has the equivalent of $30 worth of energy. But many proteins need only $1 worth of energy to perform their chemical reactions. So if we're going to join these two molecules, this protein may need $1 worth of energy. Glucose has $30 worth of energy, too much to be useful. ATP molecules have just the right amount of energy to be useful for doing the chemistry. So in a sense then, bacteria convert a single molecule with large total potential energy into many molecules with smaller quantities of potential energy. So we have glucose is a high energy food molecule. We're going to break it down and harness that energy and package it up into many ATP molecules. And sometimes this process of metabolism is compared to an engine. So just as an engine has a fuel, gasoline has lots of potential energy stored in all the chemical bonds of the molecules in gasoline. Well, that potential energy will be converted into kinetic energy, the energy of motion by the engine. Well, in the same way, the cell's metabolism, all those proteins, are converting the energy stored in glucose into smaller quantities of energy stored in ATP molecules, and then that energy is going to be used to power other chemical reactions in the cell. So we have a transformation of energy. Just as an engine transforms potential energy into kinetic, we have all the proteins doing metabolism are transforming the energy in food into smaller quantity molecules that carry more usable quantities of energy that can be used to power the chemistry of life. So the word metabolism then identifies all of the important chemistry going on in the cell, but we can break it up into two categories of chemistry. One set of chemical reactions involves extracting energy from resources in the environment like food. And so the cell will break down food molecules to get usable quantities of energy to power the next set of chemical reactions, the construction processes. So the cell will use energy to build new molecules from raw materials. The cell will need to replace old parts and to make extra parts and to grow and possibly go on to divide. So metabolism then refers to all of these chemical reactions, but we can think of them as two categories of reactions: the breakdown processes of metabolizing food to get energy, and then the construction processes to use that energy and raw materials to build new things for the cell.